I tried keto a couple times and I just couldn't get it to work.
And I think we should absolutely go into metabolic flexibility because this is really the sophistication of the wellness movement, kind of the culmination. And we'll grow every year and we'll learn more. But this is a term that a lot more people are getting familiar with because there's been all sorts of diets that have steered us in one direction or another. And kind of like the Buddha used to say, the middle path is there's something to say about the middle path. So talk to us about metabolic flexibility and how it's understanding when we incorporate it into our not only our body but our mindset can be a better way to navigate life and also a little bit more of an enjoyable way to navigate life.
It's definitely more fun than I think the alternative, which is metabolic inflexibility. So the definition of metabolic flexibility is the ability to switch between burning carbs and burning fat, depending on what type of fuel is available. You can think of it like a hybrid car that can switch between electricity and gas, depending on the type of fuel that's available. And what happens is that a lot of folks become less metabolically flexible over time because they're snacking all the time, or they've got too much stress, or maybe they've got some of those genetic variations that are associated with insulin resistance. They become metabolically inflexible, and they often get stuck in burning glucose, burning carbs. So that was my own story. When I first tried the ketogenic diet, I remember going on Atkins before I got married, and my husband lost about 20 pounds in a short amount of time, and I maybe lost 2 pounds. What I realized was that now I know in retrospect, I was carb intolerant, and I was also metabolically inflexible. I then went a few years ago in 2016, I tried the ketogenic diet a couple of times. I had a lot of patients who were coming to me on keto, and I wanted to learn more about it myself. I tried keto a couple times and I just couldn't get it to work. And part of what was the problem for me was that I was metabolically inflexible. So, for instance, to get into ketosis, it would take me about 10 to 14 days just to start to make ketones because my body was so used to burning carbs. So metabolic flexibility is really the goal. It's not that, I recommend that people go on a ketogenic diet and stay on a ketogenic diet for, long periods of time. What I recommend is using a ketogenic diet as a therapeutic pulse. So typically 4 weeks, which is what I cover in my book, and then to start to bring more carbohydrates in while you're tracking metabolic flexibility. You can track it as your ketones. You can use a breath meter like Lumen. You can use a continuous glucose monitor. You can use a glucose ketone index. There's many different ways to track this. But what we're looking for is that ease with which you can flip the switch between burning glucose and burning fat, depending on the type of fuel that's available.
It's a powerful way to really see that metabolic flexibility as a human being, as an organism, the human species, has been probably a big part of what has allowed us to become the species that we are. Travel all around the world, be able to think of advanced technologies, be able to expand our brain size because we had that flexibility, especially at times of major changes in the climate that could affect food sources and other aspects. It's also great because diet sometimes can get so tribal, and really between having using these tools, as you mentioned, a continuous glucose monitor, using things like Lumen or other breathometers that are there, you can really dial into what works well for you. On a personal anecdote, if I could add in, a few years ago when I started going to keto, and a big part of keto in the more traditional sense is making sure you get a higher amount of saturated fat inside of your diet, the clean sources of saturated fat that are there. I noticed that my health journey originally started because I had really bad acne. And I noticed that because I've dealt with so many gut issues from being on antibiotics as a child, that the saturated fat would trigger almost like an endotoxemia effect inside. And I started getting a lot of flare up of almost acne-like symptoms. And my face would be red all the time. And then on top of that, as I would track my blood results on a pretty regular basis, getting blood work every month, I noticed again for myself personally, and a big part of this is genetics coming from a South Asian background. Uh, Even though I was not worried about cholesterol, I was paying attention to my NMR particle size, and I was noticing that my lipoprotein A was getting quite high up there. And I just saw that my body, genetically, for who knows what all the different reasons are, was not as efficient as somebody else's body at utilizing that saturated fat and putting it to work. So just another reminder of how you can try things, see the actual difference that it makes for you, get your blood work done, use things like continuous glucose monitors, and then you can personalize it to what makes sense for you. Your, in cases, sometimes biological sex, which you write a lot about inside of your book, your ethnic background, which plays a role into it, and your personal lifestyle choices and goals that are there. So I think it's the combination of all of that just like you personalized it, we can all take a lesson from that and look at how we can personalize all these things that broad strokes seem to work for a lot of people, but might need to be tweaked to work for us uniquely.
That was such a helpful illustration of how keto can increase inflammation in some people, especially the dose of saturated fat. So I really appreciate how you shared that story with acne. Thank you so much. Your skin looks amazing, by the way, Dhru, I
Oh,
must say.
thank you.
But I think this brings up some really important points, which include, when I put someone on a ketogenic diet or when people follow the 4-week pulse that's in my book, what we know is that it's pretty significantly changing hormones, signaling pathways. And there's there's genomic drivers. So, for instance, part of the genetics that you inherited from your parents determine the way that you respond to saturated fat and the way that it affects the glucose and insulin pathways. So sometimes knowing that information can be very helpful, or you can track some of these biomarkers, such as the NMR lipofraction assessment that you were describing. And we know for a lot of people that LDL goes up. If we just look at, low density lipoprotein, LDL goes up in about 10%, well, about 1 in 4 people that are on the ketogenic diet. Sometimes it's not clinically significant, but it's something that we want to track and understand, especially if people are staying on it for a longer period of time, such as they do in the Verta study, which enrolled type 2 diabetics and put them on a ketogenic diet. Overall, they had about a 10% increase in LDL. So I think this individualization is so important. You said something else that I really liked, which is the tribalism that occurs around food. And what I really hope that people hear from us in our conversation today is that I'm food agnostic. So I really believe that, even though a lot of my friends are keto or they're paleo or they're vegan or vegetarian, uh, I think it's important to understand what works the best for you. So I learned, for instance, in medical school, when I went vegan, low fat, that was not a good fit for me. I needed more fat, I needed more protein for my hormone balance. So being able to understand that feedback loop, I think, is such an essential part of this empowerment conversation we want to be having with our body, our health, our hormones.